それではプロ
Now we would like to resume the sessions. Session 1, Global Renewable Energy Acceleration. The moderator for the Session 1 is Thomas Colberier, Chair of the Executive Board, Renewable Energy Institute. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. After these introductory presentations that have already described the dramatic change that is happening in the global energy market and the global energy supply system, we are now going to have a session on this acceleration with 4 speakers with different perspectives on this development. The first speaker is Professor Arturos Servos, who has served as chairman of the REN21, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century, for several years, and who has followed this development carefully. Please, Arturos, the floor is yours. You can choose if you want to sit or if you want to stand.
So good morning. Thank you, Thomas, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be with you here in Japan and share some of our thinking about renewable energy. So what I'm going to present to you is some elements of our global status report. But before that, let me just for those who don't know, just present REN21, which is a global multi-stakeholder network who has, as you see in the slides, a membership from different constituencies, from national governments, international organizations, science and academia, NGOs, and industry associations. And the Institute, the Renewable Energy Institute here in Japan and ICEP also are members of REN21. So one of the main activities that REN21 is doing is that every year issues the global status report. So it's issued in the beginning of June, which gives the picture of the previous year, what has happened in renewable energy. So what the elements I'm just going to show you are from the 2018, because the 2019 is not yet published, so the numbers will be in at the end of the 2017 that I'm going to show you. So this report comes through a network, which is a global network, has more than 900 now members around the globe, which are contributing in producing this report. Let me start. I mean, we've heard also this morning the extraordinary development that is happening all these last years, and also it was also in 2017. I'm not going to go into the numbers, as we said, because it's also the question of being at the end of 2017. What I want to say is, first of all, that in that year we had an installed capacity was added globally of 178 gigawatts, which means it's the equivalent of the installed capacity of Germany or the 2/3 of the installed capacity of Japan. So that was globally put in 2017. The other element I want to keep from that is that this comes mainly out of 2 sources, which are solar was 55% and wind 29%. So that means that solar and wind represented the 84% of the total renewable capacity that was installed. And this is what is happening in the last few years. So this extraordinary development, which is related to what we heard already this morning about the costs, the lowering of the costs of these technologies, which has made them, in most of the markets, not in Japan from what I understand, as the cheapest options. really for new developments in the power sector. So we have a power sector who has really been the big success story for renewable energies. 70%, we heard it also this morning from Adnan, 70% of the net additions to global power they came from renewables. And that was the 7th year that, in reality, renewables overcome the other sources in terms of total capacity. And 26.5% of the total electricity globally is produced by renewables by the end of 2017. So this progress in the power sector shows that the transition to renewable energy is possible, and it's happening, and very fast globally. If we just look down the decade that has passed, then we will see that in reality, in these 10 years, between 2007 and 2017, the installed capacity of renewables doubled, if we include hydro. But if we look just without the hydro, then it has increased by 6 times in 10 years. So this is coming, as I said also before, out of wind and solar, the two big success stories of renewables. If we look at the capacities in the world, then by far is China the number one, with a 30% of the world's renewable power capacity being China. So you have here China in a different scale than the others that we have here. United States being the second one, Germany, India, and Japan the fifth one, mainly from the PV capacities here. So the other element I want to put is Asia. In reality, the big development of renewables started in Europe and in a second place in the United States. But has been, in the last few years, and we see it also from this slide here, is being transferred to Asia. So from in 2017, you see that we have 178 gigawatts that have been added. 106 out of this, 60% was in Asia. And this also, we can see it in the different sectors. It's more in PV. It was the 72 out of 99, so more than 70%. And also, if we see the investment, also the 60% of the investment has happened here in Asia. So the global investment it was about 280 billion euros. But what I want also to show you here is these two bars here for each year show us what is happening in the developed and in the developing world. And the change that you see as we approach the last few years is that in the developing world, and here in emerging economies, so here China plays, of course, the capital role, is that we have more investments happening in the developing and emerging countries than in the developed world. And that's the big change of the last few years. So, and also if we see the technologies, then we see that as we expected, solar and wind really are those that are dominating all these investments. But this is not the whole story. This is the success story of the power sector. But the power sector, if we look, the consumption, the global consumption, represents only 20% of the total consumption. The electricity of the total final energy consumption, if we see it by sector, 48% is heating and cooling, 32% is transport, and 20% is electricity. So even if we go to 100% renewables in the power sector, we will cover only the 20% of the whole consumption. So in reality, if we look the targets regarding the climate change, this will not be achieved. This will not be achieved unless we do the similar development that we see in the power sector is happening in the heating and cooling and the transport sector. And there things are not really happening in the same rate. So in the heating and cooling, we have 10% of modern renewables, and in the transport, we have 3% of renewables. And this is due also, we can see that if we look at the policies that are happening around the world, the policies have been the driving force for renewables. And we see that in 128 countries we have power policies, but we have 70 countries with transport policies and only 24 countries with heating and cooling policies. And that's also shows us the direction that we have to go if we want to achieve the climate targets. So in the heating and cooling also, it's very interesting to see the connection with the energy efficiency, where we have in many countries, we have energy efficiency, and that regards mainly the building sector. And I think this is a very positive development in that direction, but it's not the whole story. And in the transport, which is mainly based on ethanol and biodiesel blend mandates that we have seen around the world, the big story that starts happening is the incentives and what is happening in the electric for the electric vehicles. And we have seen this market increasing, and we had 1.2 million cars in 2017 put on the road out of the 3 million, which is the total. So there is also a big increase that we see there happening, and I think we will see much more in the next few years. So to conclude, I would say that the transition is possible. We have seen it in the power sector, but however, the progress is not fast enough because of the other sectors to reach the Paris Agreement goals. So we need the better integrated sectors, planning policies and regulatory frameworks, and we need a systems approach to link energy efficiency and renewable energy. So let me finish by saying that one of the activities of REN21 is also a conference which is done every 2 years. And this year is in Republic of Korea at the end of October, from 22 to 5th of October. We're co-organizing together with the Korean government and the Korean Energy Agency this conference, and you are all invited to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arturo. Once again, confirmation of the rapid growth of solar and wind. Having become cheap, they are now also expanding quickly, and as a result, renewables have gone from between 15 and 20 to more than 25% of electricity supply globally. The success in electricity sector, substituting fossil fuels, however, is not matched by similar transformations in the heating and cooling and transport sector, but there are signs, in particular in the transport sector, which I could add is a result of the fact that new renewable wind and solar electricity now is cheaper per unit energy than crude oil. So it is economically desirable to make this transition. The next speaker, Jaime Bahar, is from the International Energy Agency, one of the international energy agencies that is now changing along with the energy sector, traditionally focusing on fossil fuels and security of supply for industrial countries, but now taking renewable energy seriously. And Jaime is from the Renewable Energy Division, and the floor is yours to present your perspectives on the development.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm going to continue the 2017 trend, and we'll take you a little bit to the future in the next 5 years. But I would like to start with a reality check. In 2014, 15, and 16, global emissions did not grow. We were all extremely happy about that. However, in 2017, we saw a slight increase, and in 2018, we saw another increase of global emissions. But the pathway that the world needs to go is totally the opposite of this, is the green line. I would like to do a reality check in this point that this is a huge challenge, and as many previous speakers mentioned, we need to meet with this challenge in the next future. And it will not only happen with renewables. Renewables will play a role, but it will also happen with efficiency, with fuel switching, and with other technologies. This is the reality of the challenge that we have. And the current policies that we have will not take us to this challenge. And when we look at renewables today, everyone is a little bit more and more talking about wind and solar because it's a great part of the energy system right now. It's cheaper, but in reality, half of global renewable energy consumption is coming from the modern uses of modern bioenergy. Why? The reason is simple, because as Arturos mentioned, we don't have only electricity. We have heat and transport and buildings that we consume energy. And majority of the renewable energy in the world is actually consumed in the heating sector, and bioenergy is leading that, followed by, obviously, wind and solar and hydro, which is more prominent in the electricity. One of the important things that is happening in the world is the electrification, as you can see in the red bar. Electrification is happening very fast in the transport and heat sectors, which is a good thing because we are actually successful in electrification and decarbonization of the electricity. When we look at, in the next 5 years, what is the most growth, we expect that will come from bioenergy. It might be shocking for you, but these are the two other sectors which we mentioned, is that will continue to play a leading role in the growth of renewables. Why? The answer is the same in my previous slide, because bioenergy is the most prominent technology, and it will remain the most prominent technology in buildings and industry, followed by electricity and transport sector. Biofuels is the only technology that is currently exists today to decarbonize long-haul transport in today's technology. So we expect at the IEA that renewables will cover 40% of the global energy demand, which is an incredible number when you look at 10 years ago, which was almost less than 10%, which is an important number. But the performance in the different sectors are different. So as you can see here, electricity, as mentioned, is a success story. It will continue to be a success story. We expect the share of renewables in the electricity sector to grow by 1 percentage point every year to reach 30% in 2023. However, the performance of the two will not go that fast. We expect the heat sector to grow by 10 to 12%, and transport sector almost flat in the coming 5 years, because oil demand continues to be really high in many countries despite electric vehicles. I will come back to that later. When you put all these pictures together, you can talk about gigawatts, investments, but the red line is the most important thing that we have to follow. What is the share of renewables in our energy system? And in 2017, it was 10.4%, and we expect it to increase to 12.4%. Just to give you a comparison, if we continue this trend forward, the share of renewables will reach about 18% in 2040, but in our sustainable development scenario, which has the 3 major goals of achieving climate change, like CO2 reduction, energy access, and dealing with the pollution, needs 30%. So we have a 12% of gap that we need to achieve, which means a faster development. One of the drivers that has been mentioned was cost reduction, which is driven by policies, not only policies addressing giving renewables money, but policies giving renewables a framework to operate. And this is the result of this. We collected every single auction result in the world and averaged them by the commissioning date. This is the picture for wind. This is a picture for offshore wind, solar PV, and bioenergy. We can see a new revolution where solar PV plants are giving lower prices than wind energy plants in the world in some parts. And you will see more and more the record level prices ranging between $20 to $40 in the world for utility scale plants in the coming 5 to 10 years that will become operational. And this will be the biggest trend that we need to follow in the future. And competitive schemes, the policies, are the major driver for this trend. Renewable energy auctions will represent about 60% of the global capacity growth in the world. And most of the rest is hydro, because large hydro-scale power plants are still driven by the government-driven incentives. When you look at the past, this is the capacity growth in the 5-year intervals. And in the past, you can see that how wind jumped, how hydropower remained slightly stable, and solar PV made a huge jump. This picture will be slightly different in the next 5 years. We expect that solar PV to cover the capacity growth of all renewables combined in the coming 5 years. The reason is actually very simple. Not because it's always the cheapest option, but it's easier to install. And it's much easier to finance in that case because it has less permits to take because there's no height. And one of the biggest issue of this is the distributed generation. Because you can install solar PV in an off-grid scale and in a 600 megawatt power plant. So you have a big range of investors and applications that you can do. And we actually expect at the IEA that 50% of solar PV additions will come from distributed generation. When you look at the utility scale plants, actually solar PV growth is the same as wind. Let's look at quickly to biofuels, which are currently represent the 95% of renewable use in transport today. And they will continue to grow, which was led by Latin America, mainly Brazil, and Asia. The driver in Asia is more than climate change, is energy security, because Asian countries would like to replace oil production with renewables, and they can produce biofuels themselves. But obviously, electric cars in 2023, in the next future, will take their share in the system. Road biofuels will represent 90% of renewables in 2020, followed by aviation biofuels, which is a growing trend, but also maritime and electricity. I'd like to remind one important point. Globally, electric vehicles will take their share about 4% in 2023 in the renewable energy consumption, but most of this consumption will not come from electric cars. Will come from actually buses, mainly in China, through 2 3-wheelers and motorbikes, mainly in China and India. This is the driver of the electric vehicle consumption globally, not Teslas today. Just to finish, we do an accelerated case. We identify 3 major policy areas of improvement in the renewable energy world. One is the continuous policy uncertainty. There are still countries in the world constantly changing and readapting policies. And this is actually the biggest challenge against attracting investment. So we need consistent policies that are in the long term. The second one is basically the financing challenge. We need affordable financing. Renewables are investment-heavy oriented, so they need more financing in the beginning, but less operational, so it's a different structure. And the third one is grid integration. We need to work on how we integrate renewables, how we change and design our renewable energy markets. If we do this, electricity sector has a significant 27% more potential to be installed in the just next 5 years, which will put us in line with the global targets. But also bioenergy has potential. We looked at different sectors where bioenergy has a potential, and most of the potential is not coming from new crops, is using waste, renewable waste, which we have a lot in the world, which we are wasting. So we came up with this motto that waste is gold for energy, just use it. And there's a lot of potential in the sugar and ethanol industry, in cement industry, and in advanced biofuels to use waste to produce renewables. And it's actually, the upside potential is similar to electricity for us. It's very, very important policy development that needs to take place in the short term. Just to leave with you some conclusions. So we have Paris Agreement, which is an important development about the rule book, but we need to see how this progresses. It's very key. And we see that there is no single solution to climate change. We need to have a portfolio of technologies that need to be deployed in order to tackle this big challenge that I showed. Even with the ongoing cost reductions, we need policies, but we need different policies, not policies that are giving money to renewables, because they are mostly competitive now. We need policies that give them framework to operate in the world that we live in today, which is designed a little bit electricity markets based on the marginal cost systems. And we need acceleration of bioenergy because it still has great potential, but to do this with the sustainable measures. This is the key. Without sustainability measures, bioenergy has no future. And we need to go beyond the electricity sector. We need to be looking at transport, buildings, and industry if we want to achieve the long-term targets that we have in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Heimi, for bringing to us the important observations that I've heard from IEA before, that energy efficiency has a significant potential in helping us reach the climate targets. That bioenergy is often neglected. It's big. It's not where the cost decreases have been most significant, but it is a significant contribution to global renewable energy supply. And then the impression of the IEA over the last years has been that there are lots of illustrations how your previous brave predictions of the development of renewables have been rather pessimistic and the real development has been much faster. But now you too show that it will increase significantly, so we hope that you're still underestimating the development. Do you think you are?
If we are underestimating,
yes,
which is a good thing.
Yeah. Do you think you're underestimating still? So it will be.
We will see.
We'll see.
So, yeah.
Indeed, we will see. We hope to invite you back in a few years and check whether the IEA predictions are defendable. Now it's time for Ben Backwell, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Global Wind Energy Council, to give his perspective from the wind energy industry. Ben, the floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and it's very, very nice to be here in Tokyo. Thanks very, very, very much for the invitation from Japan Renewable Energy Institute and Thomas. I want to speak very briefly about the wind industry and touch a little bit upon the opportunity for Japan as well. First of all, just to say a word about GWEC. So GWEC basically brings together some of the major corporate companies, some of the major companies investing in wind energy around the world, both developers of projects and also manufacturers of wind turbines and other pieces of components and equipment and suppliers of technology. These have become, over the last 10, 15 years, major corporations with global operations and huge, big industrial companies. And interesting to note that we now have Shell as one of our members, came on board this year, which I think is a real sign of the times as well. And we also group together all the local associations from different countries, such as the Japanese Wind Power Association and regional associations like Wind Europe and the American Association. And we basically lobby for the interests of the wind industry around the world and try and help governments create policies that can kind of accelerate the development of wind energy. I mean, first of all, I think the first point is that wind energy now is actually becoming a mature industry. It's been an incredible success story. I don't think there's been hardly any other industrial sectors that you can think of that have grown in the way that wind energy has grown over the last 20 years. We've been consistently wrong, as most people have, about our predictions. The wind industry has always grown faster than even we at GWEC expected. I'd say we are now, as Arturas and Amy talked about, we're now a kind of steadily growing kind of industry. We're not seeing the same kind of explosive growth as solar, but we are seeing wind as kind of consistently one of the biggest power sources in terms of new growth pretty much everywhere around the world. And we're seeing a group of companies emerge from probably having hundreds of companies 10 years ago producing wind turbines. We're seeing a kind of smaller group, which is basically dominated by some European companies, a couple of US companies, and a very important group of Chinese companies as well in terms of the equipment supply. As others have talked about, the main thing now is that we're cheap. You know, we're cheaper than fossil fuels pretty much everywhere in the world, although there's a very notable exception, which is Japan and Southeast Asia. Pretty much everywhere outside of those places, we can stand up and compete against coal, against gas. Pretty much everywhere we can compete in open tender. And that's something that I couldn't have stood up and said even 3 or 4 years ago. And that's really been a kind of revolutionary change for the industry. I mean, you know, we're not asking for anything anymore. We're not asking for money. We're not asking for people to subsidize us. We're merely saying now we'd like to come out and provide energy and compete in open markets. And I think that's a hugely important change. Again, I mean, as Jaime said, you know, 60% of all new capacity now is being allocated through auctions, and I think that's been a massive factor in terms of pushing prices down. And we think a similar outcome would happen in Japan if there was access to the market in a kind of more open way, and if there was enough volume in competitive tenders. We feel that the price would come down very, very quickly here in Japan as well. So, I mean, just to give one example, Germany, ever since tendering was introduced, the average prices are something like 31% below the feed-in tariff level. So it's a huge kind of drop just by doing that. And as you can see on the right-hand side, what's happened is that turbine prices have gone down, you know, continuously, and that's produced a kind of real kind of big shift in terms of manufacturing and how companies do things, as well as consolidation, the introduction of new technology. So there's a lot to be learned from how the wind industry has kind of responded to this pressure. Basically, in terms of technology, what's happening is that in contrast to solar, the wind industry is actually getting bigger and the equipment's getting bigger. These are now, you can see on the left-hand side, this is the average size of turbines. There's been a number of changes, particularly bigger rotors that are allowing kind of a better capture of wind. And the turbines have gone from being, you know, small, you know, less than 1 megawatt machines to now the average size kind of going up to the kind of 3-4 megawatts and soon to be 5 megawatts. And on onshore and offshore wind, obviously the trend is even more marked. And we are talking about turbines now in the kind of 10-12 megawatt range. And on the right-hand side, these are capacity factors. And a lot of this is to do with new technology, digital technology, better management of turbines, better sensors, better measurement of the wind. And you can see there's a kind of secular increase in capacity factors that goes everywhere, not just in places where there's very good wind, but in places where there's kind of average wind. And what used to be, you know, what we would consider low wind sites are now considered kind of, you know, medium wind sites, and going up the scale. Further trends are things like modularization. So, you know, it's not one wind turbine for a site anymore. Companies are producing basically turbines that you can modularize to capture all the different wind conditions across different sites. And then digitalization, as Adnan talked about this morning. I mean, we're moving to a digital energy system. So things like, you know, big data and predictive data analysis, sensors, being able to manage what they call intelligent wind farms and wind farms that can talk to each other so you can predict what's going to happen on a kind of microsecond level from one side of the wind farm to another. All these trends are going to produce the next kind of wave of cost reduction. This is producing consolidation. We've seen a big group of companies become a smaller group of very big advanced companies on the manufacturing side. And then on the financial side and the ownership side is actually a diversification. So what used to be before a kind of utility game basically is now got all these kind of new actors, which include pension companies, insurance companies, financial funds, corporates like the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks of this world. So ownership has actually become much more diverse, and financing costs have gone down massively as a result of this, because the universe of investors has become much more sophisticated and diverse. Obviously, wind cannot produce this, the solution, not for the climate issue, as Hamie pointed out, and not also for power systems. I mean, we're conscious that we need to work with with solar, with other technologies like geothermal and hydro, and also with storage, but also in things like better ways to manage the grid, demand response, and the whole kind of management of the energy system in a much more flexible kind of way. Our outlook is not explosive growth, but very substantial growth. These figures here, which come from our latest Global Wind report, are basically based on what we can see now. So this is based on auction volumes and what's already happening. We hope to be wrong about this, and we hope that new policies will be introduced that will allow kind of greater access in places like Japan, where there's actually much bigger potential, and there's countries that have hardly touched the surface in terms of what's possible. And one thing I wanted to mention, which is this blue part here, is offshore wind. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. So in terms of where the growth's coming from at the moment, as you can see, the traditional growth is coming from China, onshore, which is just a huge market and will continue to be so, Europe and North America. But we can see global offshore is becoming a very, very substantial part of the market. We expect offshore probably to become 20% of the annual additions. And then we have Latin America, and we also have Southeast Asia, which, again, I would hope to be wrong about this. We're starting from a very low base. The potential is huge. We're talking about growing economies with big populations that have done very little in renewables. And we actually think that in Southeast Asia, the potential to create a whole new growth area for wind is absolutely enormous. And I just wanted to finish really with offshore wind and say something about Japan as well. I mean, in contrast to some of the other technology, I think what offshore wind can do is add very large amounts of power in an industrial sense very, very quickly. And that's what we're seeing now in the UK and in Germany and in Denmark and in China, is that you can add very large chunks of power relatively quickly in kind of 3 to 5 year time period at prices which are significantly below anything else you're going to find in the power system, whether that be nuclear or coal or gas. And I think for Japan, offshore wind is really the big opportunity. I think Japan needs to move very, very fast, as others have said. There's not many areas where you can move very decisively because of things like land constraints and the difficulty over permitting. And I think if you can get the framework right for offshore wind, it's a huge opportunity for Japan. Japan has a significant industrial base, a maritime industry that's very, very sophisticated. It has engineering companies. It has turbine manufacturers such as Mitsubishi Vestas, which is one of the biggest producers of offshore wind turbines. But they sell those turbines in Europe. They don't sell them in Japan at the moment. And Japan has a fantastic offshore wind resource. So I think offshore wind really should be a mission for Japan. And I think it's a way for Japan to catch up very, very quickly, and also to leverage leadership and actually become a leader in a very significant growing sector of the wind industry. So the opportunity is huge, and I think really the next few years we're going to start to see Japan become a leader here in the wind industry. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. You described a successful industrial development where the future growth is going to be very fast in the offshore sector, which is suitable for Japan, where onshore is still a huge potential, but somewhat limited by infrastructure, but where the offshore potential is enormous. Now we're going to move to the country that Arturus initially described as the leader in all renewables, at least in solar and wind, and that is China. Li Yunfeng has been working on renewables in China as long as I have been aware that China is doing renewables, and he will now report on what is happening in China. The floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Chair. Thanks for all the friends. Since I come for the revisions for many times, took only one topic, the renewable energy in China. Today I give some of the new information for that. I give a little bit is for the background why China needed to develop renewables for that, and what's the doing in the past, and also the comparisons with the world. Also, give us a China situation, the currently also the beyond the 2020. And then later on, my colleague Ms. Wang Zhongying will give more kind of report about China renewable energy, especially for the 2050, the kind of penetration of renewables in the China energy transition. I think that for the world review for the renewable development, it started actually really large scale started 2002. Then some of the coalitions required by the UN Environmental Conference in Johannesburg. And finally, we have 2004 for International Renewable Conference in Bonn. I think this year in October we'll be in Korea for that. The people have a common standing for renewable energy development. So, of course, it should go back a little bit earlier for 1973 for the first oil crisis. The renewable stopped very quickly. But for the kind of fast speed, it's after 2004 that we formulate. Lots of organizations formulate internationally, including GVAC, they formulated 2005, yeah. I think that we also, during that, we cook ideas with authors for arena, the similar, the kind of arena, yes, for that time. I think they promote kind of renewables. You say, since then, the hydro developed very quickly, but the wind and the solar is the most popular kind of renewables in the world. They are going very fast. I think the authorities give some report already. I do not want to repeat too much. I can only give you see that is all the capacity. I think the wind and solar in the last less than 15 years or not less than 20 years at least, is over the kind of the hydro power generation. The hydro, you say, the more than 100 years. Only in the 20 years, they exceed the hydro power already. So also the cost reduction in both solar and wind is very rapidly. Like my friends at Armin mentioned, by the Bloomberg, they announced that the cheapest of power generation, the wind and the solar, in the worldwide. In the most of the country, Thomas said except Japan, but I think sooner in Japan, it should be the cheapest energy option in the future. China is, we learn a lot from all the world, including Japan. We developed a renewable law in 2003. During that time, I'm the partner at Wang Zhongying. We go to everywhere, go to Europeans, Japan, Australia, USA, and to learn what kind of policy can drive the kind of renewable energy. Then finally, we use the combination. We almost use every kind of promote policy instrument for China. Then we promote the kind of development, include hydro, of course, the wind and the solar, the increase really kind of fast. I think the outlook for China, why we start quickly for renewables. The driving force certainly for improve the energy structure. You see China, last year I mentioned that China has always have 70% of the coal domination, but we need, it can reduce coal consumptions, not only the CO2 themselves, but also for the local pollutants reductions. The second one, energy security. Usually, Japanese people always worried for energy security, but now the Chinese people have the headache for energy security. Since our oil input is already more than the USA, 3 times higher of Japan, even more. So that's a very dangerous issue. So people want to have more renewables. Also, another one is kind of protection environment. Also fight with climate change, certainly. China, the biggest emissioner, like the ban, not the ban, I think Hemi said, for the CO2 emissions in the, during the kind of 2013 to 2016, the CO2 little bit kind of reduced after the 2017 and the increase again. The major driving force is China. I should recognize these issues. Also, China for the kind of sustainable development. Since after 2013, China have a new strategy for development called high quality. High quality means everything, but include high quality of energy. So the goal at China, they have quite very clear. By 2020, they have 15% non-fossil fuels. Usually, people similar like Japan, in the beginning we hope nuclear should play very, very important role. However, from the Fukushima accident, then China also slowed down their step for nuclear, and then they put the kind of renewable energy as a majority for the non-fossil fuels. So by 2030, they hope they can non-fossil fuels also like the 20%. By 2050, no official figures available yet, but most people believe by that time non-fossil fuels in China should be 50%. Also, non-fossil power should be like 70 to 8%. Those are very, very, very high numbers and a target. So I think for the goal, the hydro, the 350 gigawatt, solar maybe the 250 gigawatt. Originally, it's 110 gigawatt, but last year we already had 176 gigawatt already. Currently, they do not officially to publish the figures, but people have negotiated the government with the industry, maybe every year 45 gigawatt for solar. That means this year, next year, there will be 90 gigawatt. It's a 90 gigawatt plus 176. That means at least it's 260 gigawatt. Wind is last year we have 185 gigawatt. This year, next year will be at least 40 gigawatt. So be by 2030, if we do good, do better, it should be 250 gigawatt like that. By 2030, the solar at least is 800, but most people believe it should be 1,000 gigawatt. wind maybe much less than the solar, but still increasing very fast. By 2050, most people believe the kind of hydro will be stopped, but for the solar, it should be more than 2,000 gigawatts. Yesterday, I read some kind of information from my Japanese colleagues. By 2050, you should have you would have 200 gigawatts. But that's okay. You have 100 million population. We have 1,300, so 10 times that's okay. So I think that we should do good for solar. That's I think the actions, that's quite a lot. I don't want to repeat for that. I think most of the driving force is kind of pollution control and energy transition, as well as the kind of emission reductions of CO2. Only the uncertainties. The Chinese people, they look like hated the USA, but not really. They always follow USA to talk energy revolution, every Chinese following. No, Mr. Trump said, no, we like a coal with no renewables. We hate renewables. Then most people said, oh, we should rethinking for that. Why the USA back the coal again? However, we should tell the politicians, the US do not really like coal yet. The coal not back in the USA, but the coal back in China in the year 2017 and 2018. We should be careful for that, but China should pay attention for that. Pollution control is the first priorities. Then the emission control for CO2. For this, China need do more work, especially for the pollution control. That's the major headache or task for the Chinese government. You say, last year, our president, Mr. Xi, mentioned by 2035, China should be the primary developed country. The major criteria is that the environmental situation should be tremendously changed. And I only added one of the questions for that. How about the PM 2.5? Currently, China is more than 50. The USA 10, European is 20. How about China? If you are really a developed country, 10, 20, or 30. Certainly you should no more than 35, the ppm. So they need clean energy. So I think there's no doubt for China energy transition from the high coal to low coal, high carbon to low carbon, and high pollutants to low pollutants. That's the situation of China energy transition and the renewable development. Thank you a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Li Yunfeng, for this description of a rapid development in China and the figures you gave for 2050 with more than 2,000 gigawatt of solar and more than 1,000 gigawatt of wind. I think few other countries have ambitions at that level of installed capacity. We now have 15 minutes for discussion between you, and I have a few questions to start with, but if you want to contradict or supplement or question each other, please let me know. First, in Ben's presentation, he showed the significantly lower capacity factors for wind in China compared to world average. And I know that this may have many different explanations, but maybe Li Yunfeng, if you can comment on this difference and try to identify what are the most important factors, why the capacity factors are so much lower in China.
There are a number of reasons. Certainly, there are a lot of explanations why China, the wind factors are lower than the average level of Europeans, especially American. You say, I can't give the final figures. In 2018, the new figures, Chinese installation of the wind power, the doubling of USA, but we have almost similar power generation. The reason have too many, but the major reason that China for the power system still the kind of planning dominate, the government dominate. That's how much you can generate it. For example, a coal no less than 4,000 hours. And similar, they code the kind of operation hours for wind. Each provinces they give the if you have over supply for electricity, they give figures, no less than how much. But the wind, they give the figures, it's much less than they should have. For example, in Mongolia, most of the kind of feasibility studies and operation, real operation situations should be the full operation hours is more than 3,000. But in Mongolia, in the average, it's 2,000. So that's one of the planning problem. Another problem is that the price issues. Wind price, relatively speaking, is a little bit higher. The people thinking if the wind generation have less kind of timing for your power generation, you still survival. Coal, we have 4,000 hours, but you already have a lot of the kind of power plant lose the money. Then we should give coal more chance. That's people. Right. That's the major two reasons. A number of reasons.
Right. So you have a problem in China similar to the problem in Japan. In Japan, it's the power companies that do curtailment of renewables. In China, it's a planning result that you allow the coal-fired power stations to operate while not distributing the electricity from the wind power plants.
Yesterday I said that the power system reform in Japan is better than US, China already. I think we need to learn something. You criticize of that Japan power system reform not as good as the Europeans, but better than China.
Okay. Feel proud, please. Take the chance. Ben, when you described the economics of wind power, you showed global averages, but isn't the most important thing about to happen that we are now able to build and operate wind power plants without any subsidies, given that the market really works? If we look at the recent development in Northern Europe, where the market is open to all, we have seen onshore wind power projects being decided to invest in Finland without subsidies, in Sweden with the electricity certificate almost losing their complete value. We still have decisions of 2 gigawatt of new wind power, and we've had auctions in the North Sea where offshore wind power plants have been offered without subsidies given grid connection. Is that something that will be a North European phenomena only for long, or will it spread?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. No, effectively, we're moving to a subsidy-free world. The question is a little bit, are other sectors still being subsidized? So I think there's two situations. I mean, there's one situation where you can directly go out and put in subsidy-free bids, as you described, in some of the offshore wind farms in the Netherlands and in Germany, and you're basically just looking at the power pool. And then there's also the question of, are you competing for new power against kind of old power that in some way is being subsidized by the system? And I think, competing for new power, we were already there, pretty much everywhere in the world in terms of what's comparable in terms of new build gas and coal. I think where you have subsidies kind of unwinded and where you have the opportunity to compete freely, that pretty much can be done at a subsidy-free basis. I think the exception is places where there are controls that prevent you from doing that. So, for instance, I mean, in Southeast Asia, I would argue that the coal industry is very, very heavily subsidized, both in terms of the kind of regulation around prices, the kind of lack of access to the market, and also in terms of infrastructure and transport. So there's still quite a lot of kind of incumbent, there's still quite a lot of kind of old mechanisms that need to be kind of unwound for the price effect to be kind of truly seen. But yeah, I mean, we would like to go subsidy-free. I think we are going subsidy-free, and we're very happy to compete pretty much everywhere where the government will allow us to compete.
And then just to explain what this unsubsidized electricity in Northern Europe mean, we look at the power prices and the future market for power. It's between 3 and 5 yen per kilowatt hour. So it's also in a part of the world where electricity prices are quite low. I'd like to ask Arturos about what trends you see in the policies. I saw you were nodding when Ben talked about removing subsidies for conventional thermal power, but what do you see as trends and important factors in the policy development in the world?
What we have been seeing, as I said before, is really the trends of the policy on the power sector. There we have seen it, become really global. There are very few countries that who don't have really policies now on the power sector. But I think it's coming also on the other sectors, because I think this is coming back to my presentation. I think this is very critical. We have the tendency to emphasize always the power sector, because we are coming, most of us, from the power industry one way or the other, and that's where our interests are. And but I think this, we're going to see that becoming really on the other sectors, coming up very importantly, both on transport and on the building sector. We have seen it coming on the building sector. We have now more than 60 countries that have, building codes with regulations for renewables and obligations for renewables. So I think these are the tendencies that we will see the next few years, and I think they are extremely important, because otherwise we will never achieve the climate goals if we don't do that.
So the period in the electricity system where renewables were subsidized or enforced,
to tell you the truth, I don't like the term subsidized.
But you had extra high prices, so you had renewable energy quotas in some countries, and that has resulted in costs coming down, so they're now possible without subsidies. You're suggesting that we will see similar developments in the transport and heat sector and so on, with hopefully a similar result.
It's much more difficult because it's very decentralized, especially the heating and cooling part. It's very decentralized. It depends on each of us at each individual in each house at the end of the day, which makes things much more difficult. But I think the tendency will be, and the emphasis will be there. But just one comment on the subsidization.
Yes.
I don't like the term, because I don't think that renewables have been subsidized. There was a compensation for the environmental externalities that are not there. So now we're talking about carbon price, which is trying to put the level there, the carbon price, to the fossil fuels. So it's, the question of subsidy is a bit more complicated than saying that the renewables have been subsidized.
I certainly understand your point. I think as long as you use the same terminology for the old thermal and the new renewables, then it's okay. It's when you're unfair that it's worth criticizing. Thank you. Heimi, you were a bit braver than your colleagues on the panel, because at least Arturos and Ben, they talked about what had happened. Li Yunfeng talked about what had happened and the ambitions for the future. But the IEA tends to make scenarios or predictions which is much more brave, because someone may come and say that you're wrong. How do you interpret the discussion on the future learning, reducing costs even further, and the policy developments allowing more renewables, how do you assess these when you make the scenarios of the kind you presented?
So the discussion on the IEA scenarios versus forecasts, so it's a long discussion, obviously. Everyone is talking about it. First of all, I would like to say that the slides that I presented is a forecast. It's a bottom-up forecast from really project by project, country by country, looking at the policies, incentives, and so on and so forth. And IEA policies, where the World Energy Outlook presents two main scenarios, new policy scenario, and these are not forecasts. These are scenarios looking at certain policies that exist today, assess those policies, and looking at how these policies will take us to the future. And I must say that IEA has been, I think, for the last 10 years, the champion of warning governments that this is not the path that we need to go. It's not that IEA says that, oh, this is the path that we will go. It says that if you do these kind of policies, unfortunately, the world will go towards a direction which is not in line with the climate scenarios. And I think this is IEA's role to tell governments, as a governmental organization, to say that, please, change these policies. That's why when you made the initial comment, we are happy when we are wrong, because which means that our voice is heard and governments are changing policies. That's the important part of the IEA's picture. And if you look at the numbers in our sustainable energy scenario, it's much higher than any other industry organization that you will see in the world. So we are actually pretty ambitious on our sustainable development scenario, and this is where we need to go.
Thank you. I think that was the best answer that I've heard from the IEA over the years, and I've heard many getting that question, so that was a brilliant answer. I think your colleagues tried to say the same thing, but not as to the point as you did. Excellent. With this, it is time to close this panel discussion. I would like to thank all four of you for reasonably well kept time in your introductions and excellent contributions both in the introductions and in the Q&A session afterwards. We are in a position where the descriptions of what has happened in the renewable energy industry is quite encouraging. We are in a process of accelerating development. We've heard now of great ambitions from China with more than 2,000 gigawatt of solar and more than 1,000 gigawatt of wind in China alone by 2050. Wouldn't that produce, if you look at and include the hydro, it would produce about half of current global electricity consumption or something like that. So China definitely has high ambitions. IEA has illustrated what may happen if we do nothing and what could happen if we act wisely on developing energy markets globally. Arturo's pointed out that electricity market success is not enough because there are other sectors where renewables also can help us substitute fossil fuels. And Ben showed us how the wind industry was growing and how the significant potential was in the offshore wind, where, luckily, Japan is perfectly placed, both industrially and geographically, to benefit from such a development and also to contribute and harvest the global market potential of successful development of offshore wind power. With this, thank you all for listening. Now we have a 30-minute break before the next session on energy business turnaround. Thank you.
パネリストの皆様、神戸理事長。
Thank you very much to everybody, Chairman Koberge, all the panelists, all the speakers. Thank you very much for your massive contribution.